Hello, and welcome everyone to the Resources Planning Act Assessment webinar, Recent and Future Trends in Forest Product Markets from the RPA Assessment. But for now, I am going to hand it off to Claire O'D to introduce herself and the RPA and our speakers today. Claire, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks again, Autumn, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Oh, turn the captions off. Thanks so much for joining this webinar, which is part of a series of webinars focused on the 2020 Resources Planning Act assessment. My name is Claire O'D. I'm the National Program Leader for the RPA assessment, and I work alongside Kathy Broughton, the Assessment Program Manager, who you may have also seen moderating these webinars. Both of us are part of the Forest Service Research and Development Washington office. Each webinar in this series is beginning with this same short overview of the RPA assessment and associated products to provide some context for the resource-specific presentations. Now, the Resources Planning Act, or RPA assessment, is the result of legislation. The Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resources Planning Act was passed by Congress in 1974 due to concerns over resource scarcity. This legislation requires a national report on the conditions, trends, and projected futures of renewable resources on all forests and rangelands every 10 years. And while the assessment originally focused primarily on an economic evaluation of whether resource supplies could meet consumer demands, a 1990 amendment to our legislation incorporated the effects of climate change. The RPA assessment was therefore broadened to assess resource conditions, ecosystem health, and sustainability to recognize the interrelationships between ecological and socioeconomic conditions in meeting the expectations of the American public. But the assessment is unique in its focus on how the interaction of economic, social, and biophysical factors affect the productivity of forest and rangeland ecosystems and their ability to meet increasing demands for goods and services. We often look at the potential impact of these factors in isolation, but to truly understand the scope of the issues we're facing, we need to understand the relationships among these factors. Ultimately, the RPA assessment provides a summary of current U.S. forest and rangeland conditions and trends. It identifies drivers of change and projects our resources 50 years into the future. Now, the RPA assessment summary document dates back to 1977. In addition to the summary assessment, we've also produced a number of voluntary mid-cycle assessment updates alongside numerous supporting documents and published data sets. I'll come back to some of the 2020 RPA specific materials toward the end of the presentation. I mentioned that the RPA assessment examines renewable natural resources. In the 2020 RPA assessment, we provided trends and projections across the U.S. for land resources, disturbance, forest resources, forest product markets, rangelands, water, wildlife and biodiversity, and outdoor recreation. Each webinar from these series will focus on one of these topics, and today's webinar is focused on forest product markets. I want to explain just a bit about how we frame our analyses, especially with respect to making projections. The RPA assessment relies on a scenario approach for making projections because it's really hard to say exactly what the world will be like in 50 years. But by running our analyses for many different possible future scenarios, we can create the boundaries within which our future is likely to fall. And this can enable us to examine the best and worst case scenarios, the outcomes predicted by a majority of the scenarios, or in some cases to take the average of the projections. So basically, instead of providing you with one prediction with really high uncertainty, we instead create a range of possible futures. And we do this by incorporating the interaction of economic, social, and biophysical factors into the development of our future scenarios. And then we use these scenarios to make resource projections. Now, these are the 4 scenarios that we used within the 2020 RPA assessment to make projections out to 2070. And you can see from this figure that our scenarios vary in terms of their assumptions about future atmospheric warming and climate change, from a lower level of change up to a high level. And they also vary in terms of their assumptions about future socioeconomic growth in the US, specifically related to population and income. Now, these RPA scenarios are linked with global scenarios from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and therefore were developed by combining global representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, with global shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. And now within each of these scenarios, we also look across climate models to examine how a particularly wet or dry or hot or least warm or middle of the road future for the US might impact our resources in different ways. This figure shows how we use these scenarios in our projections of future condition and availability of renewable resources. We first turn the theoretical scenarios into actual projections for climate, population, and income across the US. Some of this information is then directly incorporated into our resource projections, while other resource projections incorporate this information indirectly by way of incorporating RPA projections of land use, which are based upon the climate and socioeconomic projections. And that's as deep as I'm going to go today into the history and the methods of RPA. I want to turn our attention now specifically to the 2020 RPA assessment and reviewing what's new. I already discussed our new projection scenarios. As always, we incorporate data updates wherever available. We have an improved land use projection model in the 2020 RPA assessment, which projects future land use at the county scale. And we've also developed finer scaled 90-meter realizations of those county scale land use projections. These 90-meter realizations and other technological improvements have enabled finer spatial and temporal resolution for our analyses. And we have improved and extended our resource analyses, including developing projections of forest fragmentation and incorporating a new focus on disturbance, including projections of fire and drought. Now, I'd like to showcase a few of our products. Our website hosts the 2020 RPA assessment, along with all past RPA assessments and mid-cycle updates, and all supporting publications and published data sets. We've developed and will soon make publicly available an Experience Builder website on the Esri platform, which allows users to review key findings from the 2020 RPA assessment and interact with RPA data through Tableau dashboards and ArcGIS online maps, story maps. We've also developed data quick reference guides for each resource area that outline the data that's available coming from the 2020 RPA assessment, along with some general metadata and information about access. These guides can be found on a webpage focusing on using RPA data alongside a Forest Service-centric tool connecting RPA information with the Forest Service planning role. There are so many incredible scientists and people to thank for their contributions to the 2020 Resources Planning Act assessment. This is a list specifically of Forest Service scientists that served as primary author for either a chapter of the 2020 RPA assessment or a supporting publication. Now, getting back to our webinar series, each webinar will focus on one of the topics covered in the 2020 RPA assessment. Please consider joining us for future sessions and be aware that you can watch recordings of past sessions on the SAF Forest Education website. The series will culminate with a roundtable discussion on February 11th, where both federal and non-federal users of the RPA assessment will explain how this assessment has been applied in land management and policy decision-making. Today's session is recent and future trends in forest product markets from the RPA assessment, and I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Dr. Jeff Prestman is a senior research forester with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station. His research focuses on forest product markets, international trade policy, and the economics of forest-based disturbances. Dr. Prestman has a BS in forest management from Iowa State University, an MS in forest economics from North Carolina State, and PhD in forest economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Following Jeff's presentation, Dr. Justin Baker will provide a testimonial. Justin is an associate professor at the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. As an economist, his areas of interest include market modeling, international trade, the economics of forest and wood-based carbon, and the forestry aspects of climate change. So that concludes my RPA overview, and now I will hand it over to Jeff to discuss what you really came here for, which are the findings of the 2020 RPA Assessment Forest Products Markets chapter.
Claire, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It does save me some time in the presentation. It was great to work with Craig and Jingong in this assessment, and they are present today. So we may have some ability to bring them into the Q&A portion of today. I will introduce them later, but nonetheless, they really were the workhorses behind this assessment for forest products. So I'm glad they could be here with us today. Claire described some of the background information about the scenarios and how the RPA assessment was set up to evaluate potential futures. And so the forest products model that we applied to the assessment is called the Forest Resource Outlook Model, or FORUM. I'll be referring to it as FORUM. And as John Colston presented yesterday with David Walker in the resources webinar, the forest FORUM is part of a system of models that are used to project the future of the forest sector in the United States. And that includes a land use model, the forest dynamics model, and the one whose results I'm going to be talking about a lot today from FORUM. So FORUM provides the market perspective, the prices, the production levels of timber products in the United States. And so that really helps to provide the framework by which a lot of the forest dynamics are influenced in the United States. So too complicated to get into this figure, but this pretty much lays out how all these different models and inputs really interact. FORUM, I'm going to give a little bit more detail here, but suffice to say that that FORUM is a global spatial partial equilibrium model. So every country or region modeled by FORUM achieves an equilibrium in price, production, consumption, and trade, and that is across all the product categories that we model. We model the primary product, that is the roundwood that goes into producing forest products, as well as the processed products, generally pulp products, as well as the final product categories we are modeling from roundwood, other kinds of roundwood, as well as fuel wood, sawnwood, that's lumber, both softwood and hardwood, plywood, particle board, fiberboard, wood pellets, and the three primary product categories, aggregated product categories that we track in paper, which is newsprint, printing and writing paper, and other paper and paperboard. It has a cascading setup so that any kind of mill residues or even post-consumer paper that can go into the pulp sector really can feed back into the model to help us understand really how these kinds of inputs move across manufacturing within the United States and globally, so that we can have a really better understanding of fiber flow. FORUM is set up to model all regions of the United States. So the United States actually is broken up into 6 RPA regions or subregions. And so we pay specific attention to the South, South Central, Southeast, as well as the North Central and Northeast. The Rocky Mountain is a single RPA region, and the Pacific Coast is another one, which includes Alaska, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, California. Around the world, we have really made FORUM to address trade and production, consumption, and prices in our major trading partners and major global producers and consumers. Some countries that are maybe smaller countries or lower producers, they may be added together with some other countries, and they are modeled in one aggregate. But the major countries in terms of the forest product sector are separately tracked. Claire did lay out the scenario setup for the RPA. There are 4 main scenarios. I wanted to just highlight that in the forest product sector modeling, we're also accounting for other aspects that are not really part of some of the other resource area models that form the RPA. What we need to pay attention to are things such as technology change. So as the world changes, technology advances, resource uses become more efficient. Trade openness, the different scenarios really involve some assumptions about how much tariffs and how many other kinds of trade measures are applied. So across the different scenarios, there are ranges of trade openness. And finally, bioenergy preferences. Under some scenarios, there's pretty high preferences for using wood to generate energy, and other ones low. There's one low one we want to point out, which really has a different trajectory, and that is the HL scenario, where we project really a downward trend in some of those bioenergy preferences. But 3 out of the 4 scenarios anticipate higher level of bioenergy production and consumption. So let me get into some of these results here. So here we're just looking at industrial roundwood around the world in 2 different categories. One nice thing about Forum is that we track separately hardwood and softwood, which is different from some models. So we see that in the softwood category in the left graphic there, North America has been the largest producer. When I say North America, we're thinking especially US and Canada here, and it's been the global leader in softwood, roundwood consumption as well as production. And in terms of hardwood, Asia has been the global leader for quite some time. You could think of that as a lot of that is hardwood. I mean, a lot of that is tropical, but some of it is things such as eucalyptus and other kinds of planted hardwood. For roundwood, we can look at 2 different trends for the United States. Here, let's look at U.S. Roundwood exports. So United States does export roundwood. We export softwood and hardwood logs. And so that means that those logs are going to other countries to manufacture products in those countries and maybe sometimes send them back to us in terms of finished products. But we mostly export softwood logs, although hardwood logs are a significant component of our exports. We project that those rates of exports will rise over time. And in fact, that's primarily due to increasing demand around the world due to economic and population growth. In terms of the types of roundwood production, it's shown here in the second graph. Generally, most of the roundwood we're modeling is the industrial roundwood kind, which goes into manufacture of products, forest products. A small part of our total roundwood is in the form of fuel wood and other kinds of roundwood. So although we're exporters of logs and certain kinds of lumber, the United States has been generally a net importer, or let's say a negative net exporter of softwood lumber. So our main trading partner in softwood lumber is Canada, although we do receive significant amounts from other softwood lumber producing countries such as Brazil and Chile and some European countries, New Zealand even. So we do see that we are pretty import dependent on softwood, and under all scenarios, we project that import dependence to rise over time. When it comes to hardwood, it's the opposite situation. We tend to export more hardwood lumber than we import, so we're one of the world leaders in hardwood lumber exports. And in total, our production is projected to rise over time to the end of our 50-year projection period. Another thing to notice is that we can break out these results by RPA region, so across the regions of the United States, and it is important to understand and appreciate where some of this lumber is being produced here. In terms of softwood, it's pretty evenly divided between the South, the Southeast and South Central, and the Pacific Coast. So think about Oregon and Washington and California produce a lot of softwood lumber. And then hardwood, it's a little more evenly divided across regions. So the Northeast and North Central do produce a significant amount of that. In fact, about half of the hardwood lumber is produced in the North, and most of the rest is produced in the South, a small share in the Pacific region. Let's look a little bit at panels. So this is the aggregate of plywood and oriented strand board and other forms of panels. We see that we would project a large increase, a relatively large increase in wood-based panel production in the United States, continuing some of the recent trends, recovering from the most recent recession. Remember, they're on the recovering from the deep recession of 2007 to 2009. And notice on the left graphic there, though, that it does not go down to 0 on the vertical axis, so that's more like about 30. So we did go down over time, but it's been coming back up since then, and we project that trend to continue across all scenarios. By region, the main producer of panels is the South, so that's mainly the South Central, also the Southeast, and primarily in the South, we're talking about oriented strand board. So that's a structural panel that goes into construction. The paper sector is kind of a different story. So it's really a mixed bag. And this has been a consistent story in the RPA assessments going back for a while. The recognition that electronic media are substituting for paper in lots of cases. And especially we're talking about newspaper. For newspapers, not as many people receive the newspaper anymore or buy newspaper. And that trend will continue into the future, in fact, globally as well as in the United States. Here on the left, we show that for printing and writing paper, which has also been on a decline, although not quite as steep as newsprint, we show a broad decline in total consumption. That's true around the world. It was going up for a while in Asia, but trends really kicked in by 2020 across the world, and we anticipate that total consumption of printing and writing paper and newsprint will go down quite a bit by 2070. In fact, for the newsprint sector, we anticipate that newsprint production and consumption will go down to near 0 under some scenarios by the middle of the century. A different story could be told about other paper and paperboard. So when you talk about other paper and paperboard, we're talking about paper for packaging, but also, let's say, household paper. So things like paper towels and tissues. So these kinds of paper products are demanded, and they will continue to be demanded. They're not going to be substituted away by electronic media. You might think that the other paper and paperboard is even facilitated by electronic media because we can now order things online, and so a lot of the paper consumption we have, and paper production too, is going to packaging of the things that we buy. The story is an increasing amount of that into the future. Most of that produced in the South. And in terms of, we can also break that down by pulp. And it's important to see here that a big share of the fiber going into the paper sector is in fact recycled fiber. So we call that waste pulp in this model. So a lot of the paper that you're recycling is going back into products, and that trend will continue into the future. Wood pellets is another story we could tell, and I had mentioned earlier that only under one scenario do we see a projected decline, and that's by assumption of policies, say, going away in Europe. The other trends are positive, and that's consistent with a continued policy of use of wood pellets as part of the bioenergy, the energy mix in Europe, and we export a lot of what we produce. In terms of production by region, almost all of that's in the South, in the Southeast, and the South Central, pretty evenly divided between those two parts. Maybe the Southeast produces a little bit more. That's along the Atlantic coast, south of New England, south of Maryland. So those trends are projected to continue and into the future, and we can anticipate not quite a doubling, but almost a doubling by 2070, even under our say business as usual scenario. Before I stop here, I do want to highlight that the RPA scenario is not the RPA assessment does not carry out specifically policy analyses. However, that doesn't mean that the tools and the people involved in the RPA are not involved in some of these policy relevant studies. So the tools that we've developed through the RPA have been used to answer specific questions. For one, we can answer more detailed questions about the South, and that's covered in the Southern Forest Outlook, recently published. And I encourage you all to go take a look at that. We've looked at things like the effects of natural disturbances on global markets and U.S. product markets, recently published. Mass timber use in non-residential construction, a recent paper lead authored by Prakash Nepal, another collaborator in a lot of this RPA work. Global wind energy market development. Where is the carbon being stored in housing? We have projections to 2070, and that's covered in one paper recently published. And then finally, sea level rise. But this is not exhaustive. Sea level rise, we've been looking at that, understanding how rising seas may affect losses of structures along coastlines in the US, but especially globally. And that has the implication of affecting product markets. There are new developments. I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but suffice to say that we're continuing to build the forum model and the methods and how the different components of the resource models interact into the future. And so stay tuned for more and better models for the next assessment in 2030. So just to finish up here, we do see a rapid rise in global roundwood demand growth, supporting our prices, and that includes hardwood and softwood. We will continue to be likely to be import dependent on softwood, according to our assumptions, and unless there are major trade policy changes, then there might be. We would anticipate that to continue. Hardwood is a different story. You saw the graphics. We are still net exporters there. The electronic media story is really affecting the paper sector, and you all have been part of that change, observing it and participating in it. And finally, I wanted to mention, of course, that one thing that comes out of this assessment, it's been a growing part of it, is understanding the role of the South, and it will continue to be the major player in the United States. Thank you very much, and that's all I have, and I think we're on to the next, to the testimonial section here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here today. So my job is to provide a testimonial on the potential public benefits of RPA market projections. And so I'm going to break this brief set of talking points down into kind of three different areas. How RPA can support new research, industry, and education. And so I'll talk a little bit about my experiences in each of these capacities and using RPA, relying on RPA, and been really benefiting from the existence of this great tool and this great data set. So my job here is not to steal the spotlight, but to really talk about the great work that has been done by the fantastic scientists involved in the RPA effort. So let me move on to my next slide here. So just as a bit of background, I use the RPA in a number of ways in my professional capacity. First, as an educational tool. I've integrated RPA into the classroom, both in my forest economics and in my natural resource management course that I teach here at NC State University. Both of those courses have a mix of undergraduate and graduate students. And we also talk about RPA data sources, and use RPA in the context of training graduate students in my lab and within this Southern Forest Resource Assessment Consortium, or SOFAC. I've used the RPA for a long time, going back to previous iterations in my own research to help calibrate and develop assumptions for the models that I work with and develop. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about how forest managers and industry can use or rely on RPA and associated market projections. Okay, so first off, let's talk about education, because I think RPA is a fantastic tool for introducing students to concepts such as scenario planning. Right, what does it take to establish a baseline? Right? I think the documentation, the really extensive documentation around the scenario assumptions within the RPA, which captures potential future changes in socioeconomic conditions, maybe some policy change assumptions, but certainly changes in how we think the environment may change under different levels of radiative forcing, can be a great illustration for the amount of detail and nuance that goes into developing baseline assumptions. And it can also be a great illustration on why a single baseline may not make sense, right? If you're a forest manager, or if you're developing management plans, it may not be enough or sufficient to assume that the world is going to continue to behave as it has in the past, or that we're on a single trajectory. We may want to envelop some notion of uncertainty or variability in where the future might be heading into our analysis and planning. It also helps us talk about in training how we develop alternative scenarios, alternative visions of the future, how we use these plausible potential future pathways as a jumping off point for doing more nuanced analysis around new market developments, environmental change forces, or policy change. And finally, in the context of my natural resource management class, and to a certain extent in forest economics, we talk about the RPA and how we can use the types of model projections coming out of these research efforts for conducting broader trade-off assessments. Another point that I wanted to mention briefly, we often talk about relaying expectations of where regional or global markets are heading back to management decisions that we make at a very local scale, right? So how do our expectations of where markets are heading affect our choices for how we manage a particular forest, or from, say, the TIMO REIT perspective, how we manage a collection or an inventory of forest assets over time. And so those expectations of where the market is heading can really influence how we manage those assets today. Second, let me just talk a little bit about research, right? So I've been using RPA from when I was in graduate school, and we were using projections developed by Ralph Ehlig and colleagues on land use change to inform what we call exogenous inputs or assumptions, right? So we use outputs from the RPA in other models to help us frame where we think the U.S. is going in terms of land use change. How much land do we think will be available for conventional forestry or agricultural production, given development pressures that we might expect, right? So the RPA tool provides an excellent resource for the modeling and the forest sector research community in terms of framing and validating some of our own model assumptions. The RPA tools also provide an excellent benchmark for model comparison efforts. So on the right-hand side here, I've got a figure that we published from a paper in 2022, kind of a first of its kind global forest model and a comparison project effort. And that project did rely on kind of the predecessor of the forum model and had collaboration from two of the individuals that are on this call today. And we're in the process now of expanding that kind of global scale model comparison exercise to account for new scenarios, new expectations of where markets or environmental change might be heading. And we think there's real opportunities here for engagement with the RPA team. And so as a research tool and as an education tool, the amount of data available from the RPA and the level of detail and the projections provided really do help us not only in comparison efforts, but also in sort of kind of benchmarking against our own baseline assumptions or against our own model projections. And similarly in industry, I think this benchmarking idea is really important, right? So most organizations, large companies, private entities have some notion of where they think the market is heading, either due to their own analytical or kind of internal modeling efforts, or due to other reports and outlooks that they may read and kind of base investment decisions on. And so the RPA provides kind of a nice kind of publicly backed set of market projections that folks in industry, be that forest product manufacturers or forest managers, can use to sort of compare against their own assumptions about where markets are heading, to use to give some sense for the potential variability in future market conditions. And I think in that context, these projections can be useful in terms of signaling potential investment opportunities, or if the opposite is true, where investment may need to slow down a bit. So those are the kind of three main areas that I see that are really big benefits of the RPA and these associated market projections. As I mentioned in my capacity, we work with RPA in our modeling. We collaborate with RPA scientists and look forward to continuing to do that. And I think that the tool can be really useful for kind of training the next generation of scientists, practitioners, and decision makers who are faced with these sort of tough, wicked challenges related to resource management under so much future uncertainty. So I wanted to talk very briefly about some potential areas for future research directions to maybe tee up the Q&A section. And none of this is a surprise. I've actually seen some questions come up in the Q&A already, or in the chat Q&A already. seem relevant here, right? And so some areas where the RPA may consider for the future. You've seen some of this highlighted already in Dr. Presteman's comments on supplementary resources. But we're going to see some additional work and research around emerging markets, especially those new products that we hear a lot about, for which there may be growing market interest, things like mass timber. But going beyond mass timber, thinking about novel biomaterials from forests or other potential uses or niche markets sourced from smaller diameter pulpwood, such as biochar, for instance. So how do we incorporate some of these new and emerging market dynamics into our kind of broader regional and global scale market projections? I think that's a question that we could wrestle with a little bit. Second is just thinking about complementary policies in housing, really in other sectors of the economy. So I mentioned housing and construction as examples here, right? I think there's a lot that needs to happen in those two sectors to really see a mass timber market thrive. But you could easily say the developments in energy-related policy or in industry and manufacturing and artificial intelligence could also have implications for the forest sector and the forest products industry that maybe we're not yet capturing in our models. And how do we think about that in a very proactive way? And so finally, the last point here, and you've seen Dr. Presteman's team is already working on this quite a bit, but not just Dr. Presteman's team, the RPA team in general has really invested a lot of attention and research effort around emerging disturbance risk, right? But I think there may be an opportunity here to think about policies or investments in response to those disturbance events, right? So what happens in the case of new publicly backed investment in restocking or reestablishing hurricane-affected forest areas? How do those inventory dynamics play out in a marketplace? What happens if we have a large source of new harvests from public lands out west in fire-prone regions, right? How do these dynamics play out in systems frameworks such as the RPA assessment framework? So these are just a few areas where I would love to see some new work. I'll sort of skip to the end here because I think I'm at my time. And I just wanted to say thanks again for this opportunity, and I'll hang around for the Q&A, but obviously I am not the expert and will most likely defer to the RPA scientists.
Great. Thank you so much to our speakers, both Justin and Jeff. I'd encourage both of you to come on camera and Craig and Jingyoung as well for our Q&A session. Jeff, if you're able to turn on your...
Sure,
there you come.
Sure, and I wanted to make sure I introduced Craig and Jingong. So Craig is an independent consultant that's been a collaborator with, in the RPA for several years, Jingong also. So Craig and Jingong especially, Craig and Jingong were developing the forum model when we first started interacting, and it's been great ever since, and lots of collaborations going on. And Craig and Jingong actually led a lot of the analytical piece of this forest products chapter, so they are able to answer questions even better than I can in some cases. So they're around to field some of those questions.
Terrific. We have had some questions come in already, and I certainly encourage all of our audience to use the Q&A to send in your questions. To start with, there's a question about how trade openness is related to climate model differences. I think that relates to our scenarios, kind of how we've got the climate models and trade openness varying.
I can jump in from like mechanically how it was done. In terms of the design of the scenarios, I'd leave it maybe to Jeff or Claire. But in terms of the actual mechanics of the model, I mean, they're actually fairly independent, but they are connected in a certain way. So there is an interaction. I think there was a discussion during yesterday's webinar of the interaction between Forum and some of the other RPA models, like the forest dynamics model. And so there was this back and forth kind of soft linking of models. So in a sense, the price and consumption profiles that came out of Forum that kind of fed and informed the forest dynamics model, it was reacting to changes in trade openness. So the ability for a certain region to change its import or exports, for example, as driven by the trade openness, would influence price and consumption. And those, again, factored into the forest dynamics model in that soft linking exercise. So it's kind of an indirectly related to some degree. But more or less, they're just kind of different storylines that were representative of the four scenarios.
Yeah, I also want to add that the forum also used the positive program, mathematical program calibration process. It can internally include this trade openness.
Great. We also have a question about why there was a softwood drop at 2060. I don't know if you can, if you have any knowledge.
Sure what chart. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if I know which chart that's referring to. Jinggang, did you catch that, or Jeff?
Yeah, it's slide 6. Well, it was about rising roundwood exports. So there is a drop in our exports of softwood starting about 2060 for softwood lumber. Softwood roundwood, I'm sorry. I think that's what the question is referring to. That's the only kink I see there, and that could be related to any number of factors, but it's hard for me to tease out exactly what was going on in the modeling, and that's in the HM scenario.
I see it now.
Possible,
yeah, okay.
one possible scenario, one possible explanation is the key drivers for on the demand side is the GDP growth, and if the GDP reached a plateau, or it might shift the demand and reduce the foreign demand for U.S. lumber, and reduce the you might see the drop. That's one possible reason. Correct?
Yeah, I think you're right, Jingong, exactly. So when you look at again, I think, Jeff, you had made reference to this, that the demand curves for many of these, especially softwood lumber, is driven predominantly by GDP and population. And so when you look at these GDP and population projections across the SSPs, which were inherently used to drive our RPA socioeconomic assumptions, for most of those are kind of plateauing by mid-century, even for some of the developing countries. And it's likely the case that that's, again, what's driving that, and what's driving the kind of kink in that export of softwood lumber. Softwood logs.
Yeah, and I could just add to that is that we might also think that there is development of softwood log production, softwood roundwood production capacity overseas that's going on that can really help to stem our exports of those products. I also want to say is that, yes, and Craig mentioned this, that across the scenarios, for a few of those scenarios, we really do see a plateauing of global population. It's happening as we speak. We know it. China's already shrinking. These kinds of things are going to influence long-run product markets. So our models are sensitive to that.
There was some discussion about this in both presentations, but a question about any analysis of future for mass timber construction, now that we're seeing a huge increase in interest and use of smaller material, jointed and glued. So I know this was touched on, but any further discussion of what has been done or what is being done?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are working on this on the side. I think Jeff had kind of made a couple nods to some pieces that were that have already been published, actually, I think, by some Forest Service folks. And we also have some other work ongoing that's looking at this. Now, mass timber, these types of models typically require a large comprehensive data set to calibrate them. And the unfortunate case for us at this point in time, or when we were doing this work, is that there wasn't a comprehensive data set on mass timber. But the good news is that FAUSTAT from the UN actually now has included that as a product. So moving forward, that could be actually integrated more formally into a model like this or other models. But with that said, what we've done in recent years is conducted one-off assessments of mass timber demand scenarios. We've actually done one using Forum that's been published in sustainability recently in the past couple of years. That looks at designing these kind of what-if demand scenarios and the potential impacts that would have on U.S. and global forest markets, among others. Jeff has also flagged a couple as well.
And if I could just add to that a bit, yes, thanks, Craig. Yeah, we're working on that now. Whether how it comes into future iterations of the RPA assessment, I guess remains to be seen. Perhaps the new data will help that. And I also want to say that mass timber is a fairly new product. At least it's. I guess the more frequent demonstration of its use is happening more and more. It's still a very small part of construction wood, and it could be really big in the future. And I keep on bringing up this idea that in the mid 1980s, oriented strand board was almost nothing. It's 2/3 of the structural wood-based panel market today, more than plywood, softwood plywood. So big things can happen, and they may well. Sometimes that kind of future is hard to predict, but we're doing our best with the modeling right now.
Yeah, I also want to add that, as Jeff just mentioned, we also published a Thousand Forest Outlook. In that outlook, we downscaled the mass timber demand scenarios, and just in a nutshell, it shows the U.S. South is going to benefit this mass timber development, and especially Southeast. That's based on the Thousand Forest Outlook analysis. Yeah, thanks.
Great, and I will put in a plug again on our website. We list the supporting documents. So if you go to the website, you can find a lot of these publications that were mentioned. And Jeff, we can circle around and make sure that that's an updated list, but a lot of the things we've talked about are definitely reflected there. Next question, and I believe these two are connected looking down the list a little bit. Was export of softwood logs to be used for lumber production part of the model, or the percent of softwood roundwood exported to Canada, then imported as lumber? I think those are related.
I'll let Craig answer that one.
Yeah, absolutely it is. So markets will meet demand either through domestic production or through trade, and it's calibrated to a certain time period using Faustat data, which includes the trade data as well, and how that whole input-output structure works, how logs are used to produce downstream products, including imported logs. So that's definitely there. I don't know if I quite captured that or heard that second part of the question. I don't see it in the chat unless I'm.
Oh, down further by the same.
Oh, I see. Yep. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So same. I mean, all that whole network would be reflected in the model. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Great. Next, models to test and calibrate models is a little bit of circular thinking. Applaud the use of them to help teach scenario concepts. Where is the benchmarking tied to actual measurements and inventory validation? Models can be helpful, but they are not always supported by field-based measurement and data, for example, FIA.
I can take that one.
I mean, it's a good point. Oh, go ahead, Justin.
So I think my comments on model calibration and benchmarking might have led to this question. So let me just start by saying that I think individual models do things comparatively well relative to other models. And so sometimes when I say we use models to inform other models, it's because we can't capture everything with every model. And so, for instance, in the past, the RPA projections on land use change, for instance, have been incredibly informative in helping us in other forest and agricultural sector models and calibrating assumptions related to the loss of productive land. So the other aspect of this question is related to kind of use of FIA and validation. And I'll say, I can't speak for the RPA suite, but I will say that every model I've worked with, from the sub-regional timber supply model, the forest and agricultural sector optimization model, the global timber model, land use and resource allocation model, they all use FIA as a basis for defining initial inventory conditions. The FIA is an incredible resource to the research community, and almost everybody in modeling uses it extensively to help build their models.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. That's I'm glad you followed up on that, and yeah, just to add a couple pieces relevant for the forum and the RPA model suite. So I mean, it's a good point. We have to be just cognizant that these are models, and we're projecting very far into the future. So there is a high degree of uncertainty around these projections. And I think, Claire, you captured it well in terms of justifying the scenario-based approach earlier on. So a series of kind of what if kind of circumstances, and we're looking at the likely evolution of markets under those circumstances. But again, it's through a model approach. So I think we have to be cognizant of that. And FIA data does inform Forum, for example, in terms of the inventory levels and the growth rates. And it also, we're cognizant of the fact that these large market models like Forum, Justin mentioned some others, these are describing in very great detail the economic market of forest products, but sometimes have a relatively more crude representation of, forest land cover, for example. And so what we tried to do in the RPA assessment is, again, link to some other models that have more representation on that side that are calibrated to FIA data to feed off each other. So we kind of take the advantage of the best pieces of each model to try to come up with our scenario runs there as well.
Thank you. Next question. Will any of your scenarios predict a shift from traditional wood products in residential and maybe commercial building construction to more fire-resistant materials, thinking about the effects of the current fires in California and how much the insurance industry may cause changes?
Yeah, so these are nuanced kind of storylines that are difficult to capture in a broader set of scenarios like we use for the RPA, or that are more traditionally used in kind of setting up these longer term projections like that are governed by SSPs or RCPs. So this would really be kind of more of a one-off piece. So the short answer is no, we haven't looked at that, at least using Forum. And to do so would require kind of more of a stylized individual set of scenarios to try to capture that.
Great. In the 1990s, federal forest management changes reduced timber harvests in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California national forests and BLM lands by 90%, and on large national forests, the Tongass in Alaska, by about 100%. Would a return to full management on those lands have a large impact on RPA projections? The Tongass had 2,600 TPD sulfite pulp mills and a handful of sawmills producing about 100 MMBF each. To some degree, the reductions extended east as far as South Dakota.
Yeah, so I think the short answer here is yes, it potentially could have an impact on the projections. So what we do is we calibrate basically these supply curves for each region. So it's the kind of the marginal cost of producing timber as Jeff had kind of shown you in these 6 RPA regions, and that's calibrated based off of FIA data among some other data points. But it's going to reflect kind of more current market conditions in that area, how much has been produced in those regions recently, the prices coming out of those regions, and that's kind of going to reflect the marginal cost of producing there. And to some degree, indirectly, kind of the management practices there, any sort of like policy or restrictions that are embedded in that area will be reflected in those supply curves. So any changes to those could influence the model. It could make it that region, more cost effective in supplying fiber to market, for example, or the other way around. But it could certainly influence the market outcome.
I can add to that a little bit. So there have been studies about the effects of that kind of harvest reduction that happened in public lands in the Western United States. And generally, what happened is that some of the production shifted to the south. So if that gets reversed, you might anticipate some reversal in the shares there, and that's driven through prices and through demand. So you can imagine that a large increase in total roundwood production off of public lands in the West would feed into lowering prices elsewhere, particularly even in the South.
We have one last question, which I think we've touched on a bit, how this works within RPA, but there's a question about new products in general, and an example of the first year disposable diapers appeared in retail markets. The tonnage exceeded that of any other paper product type.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that is really difficult to capture in these models, is the development and kind of creation of new products. I mean, we can't really always predict the creation of a new market or product, but if we do have kind of hints about a new one developing, or one that's kind of at the early stages, like mass timber, for example, that's one that we can craft scenarios on. But we're still challenged, as I mentioned earlier, with underlying data. So usually that would require a very scenario-based what-if approach. Wood pellets was another example. I think in the previous RPA assessments, we kind of had hints that this was a developing market, had very limited data, ran some kind of ad hoc scenarios on those. Now you fast forward to the 2020 RPA, we do have now a comprehensive data set on wood pellets, and that was integrated into the new market model. So unfortunately, that seems to be how it kind of works. And it's, again, we're limited just based off of the data at the end of the day.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. That is the list of Q&A that we received. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to Autumn to close us out.
Yes, thank you everyone again for your time here spent with us. This is a fantastic webinar, and I am excited for our future webinars.